Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the Scientific Communication workshop series. This is the second workshop in the series, and this is Dr. Ann Curtis. She's going to be talking about translating clinical and translational research into clinical practice guidelines. Please feel free to ask questions in chat as you need to, and I will then ask at a natural break within the presentation. And there's going to be a breakout room as well, so please look for that. And there's going to be basically you looking at some guidelines and looking at an area that you would like to look at within those guidelines and really kind of looking into the research behind that. So there'll be a breakout session as well. And I want to tell you that if you are interested in the micro-credential in scientific communication, please feel free to contact me. We can always push due dates back. It's never a problem, so that you can get the micro-credential and digital badge in scientific communication if you wish to do so. And also I'm going to be placing in chats these slides towards the end of the presentation. And I'm also going to be placing a guideline booklet within there. So please feel free to use those. The guideline booklet you're actually going to need. So please make sure you're able to receive that. And then finally, I'm going to be putting, again, as I have in the past, the survey also. And those surveys are very important because they help us to improve the program, and they also help us to report out to our funding sources. So very important, and they only take about 2 minutes to complete, which is nice. So I'm going to now turn this over to Dr. Curtis, and I think you're going to be incredibly informed by her incredible presentation today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and I'm happy to be here with everybody today. I was asked to speak on this topic, which really addresses the whole issue of how is all the research that we do, starting from very basic research on through patient care research, how do they become the practice guidelines that guide how physicians actually take care of patients? And there's a very direct correlation that I think you should find interesting and informative. So what I want to do in the next 45, 50 minutes or so is cover these topics, definitions of the types of research that impact clinical guidelines, discuss how the guidelines are developed, how do we all get involved in those guideline writing committees, and once we have the recommendations in the guidelines, then how do we disseminate those recommendations to the medical community? Because it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to have guidelines and nobody knows what they are or what they're telling us to do. And then finally, it's not just the medical community, but it's also the lay public has to understand important research developments because it matters to them and their own health. So translational research goes from T1 to T4. I think it's worth understanding the definitions here. So if you start with T1 research, it tests the findings from basic research that you would do in a basic research lab, test them for clinical effect and or applicability. It gives us knowledge about human physiology and the potential for an intervention. And one of the reasons why this is very important, because this speaks to not only clinical research proposals, but even more fundamental ones. Significance is a critical component of any research grant application. So you have to know why it matters what it is you're finding out and how you apply that to humans. So in T1 research, there may be preclinical and animal studies. We may look at human physiology. First in humans of testing a new technology are typically done in healthy volunteers, simply to learn things like what dose of a drug leads to what kind of a blood level, and are there side effects that we see. Proof of concept would be something here. Proof of concept means that you're testing it in a small number of patients, and you get enough data that says, yeah, this is worth testing in a larger group, because large clinical trials are expensive, and we want to make sure that we do the right ones that are going to yield the greatest value. And then T1 research also includes phase 1 clinical trials, where you test a new biomedical intervention in a small group of people, so say 20 to 80, and again, identify efficacy and evaluate safety. So what dose ranges do you think you would use when you get to a larger clinical trial? And then there's translational research, T2, where you test those new interventions in controlled environments because you want to form the basis for clinical application and evidence-based guidelines. So in this case, you do want to study patients that have the particular problem that you're investigating. And so examples of such studies would include phase 2 clinical trials, where you study the biomedical or behavioral intervention in a larger group of people, often several hundred, so that you can determine efficacy and further evaluate safety. And then phase 3 clinical trials are often called pivotal trials. They will be broad clinical investigations. They can involve several hundreds to thousands of human subjects to evaluate an experimental intervention in comparison with a standard or control intervention, or to compare 2 or more existing treatments. These can be pharmacologic, non-pharmacologic, and behavioral interventions given for disease prevention, prophylaxis, diagnosis, or therapy. It also includes community trials and other population-based intervention trials. So one example here could be something like a new cancer drug. And we already know that drugs A, B, and C work in a particular cancer. We've now got drug D. And sometimes you can study those against each other. Sometimes patients are treated with A, B, C, and D versus A, B, C alone, because you want to give people the best current therapy. And then you want to see if adding on a new drug or a new intervention is going to improve outcomes even more than you already have. Now, I'm using here an example. My field is clinical cardiac electrophysiology. So I'm a physician and a cardiologist, but I specialize in cardiac electrophysiology, and that is the study of cardiac arrhythmias and their treatment. So this is a study for which I was one of the site investigators, and it was called amiodarone, or an implantable cardioverter defibrillator for congestive heart failure. And the point of this study was to say, we know that patients who have advanced congestive heart failure are prone to sudden cardiac death. And it's something that we very much need to prevent to improve survival in these patients. Amiodarone is an antiarrhythmic drug. It works on ventricular arrhythmias. It could be a promising intervention to make that better. Another alternative is an implantable cardioverter defibrillator that won't stop an episode from happening, but it can treat it and convert it back to normal. So the point was to test each of these interventions against placebo. And this is just really summarizing what I just said, that these treatments have been proposed to improve the prognosis in patients with congestive heart failure. So in this case, there were over 2,500 patients. New York Heart Association class 2 or 3 heart failure. What does that mean? That means that patients have symptoms with ordinary or less than ordinary activity, such as shortness of breath, exercise intolerance, that sort of thing. They also have a left ventricular ejection fraction less than or equal to 35%, which means their heart function is decreased. So they have weak hearts and they have symptoms from it. And the point of the trial, because these patients are at risk for sudden cardiac death, was to randomize the patients to conventional therapy for congestive heart failure and a placebo, conventional therapy and amiodarone, or conventional therapy and an ICD, implantable cardioverter defibrillator. And a shock-only single lead is just a very basic kind of defibrillator. And the primary endpoint here was death from any cause. And that's actually one of the strongest endpoints we ever see in clinical trials. You usually need either a lot of patients or a smaller number, but very highly at-risk patients who might be suffering death to make that a viable endpoint for a clinical trial. But you can't argue it. A patient's either alive or dead, and that's why it's a gold standard if you can do it. This is what we call a Kaplan-Meier curve. And it is the primary results from this trial that were published 19 years ago now. And what you can see here is that the placebo arm and the amiodarone arm were just about on top of each other. The placebo arm is the green and the amiodarone arm is the blue. And out to 5 years of follow-up, the mortality rate, which is what's on the y-axis there, was really pretty much the same. So what that told us is that it's a waste of time to give amiodarone to patients for the sole reason that you're hoping that their survival will be better. Importantly, though, you can see that the purple curve, the purple line for ICD therapy was lower than the other two, and it greatly reduced the death rate in these patients. So it tells us that whatever kind of systolic heart failure you have, where the heart function's diminished and a patient has symptoms from it, if you put an ICD in, they will survive longer than patients who don't get that therapy. So that's one good example of a clinical trial. T3 research explores ways of applying recommendations or guidelines in general practice. So that takes us beyond the realm of a pivotal clinical trial, like I just showed you, to phase 4 clinical trials. And those are studies that are conducted after the intervention has been marketed. And why would you do that? Well, you've done a study in 2,500 patients, but maybe if you studied or knew about larger numbers of patients who had these interventions, that some safety or efficacy signal might pop up that you couldn't see when it was smaller numbers of patients. So you're looking for adverse effects that weren't appreciated earlier, things like that. This kind of research is also health, it could be health services research, which involves dissemination, communication, implementation, and it also includes clinical outcomes research. And then finally, there's T4 research, and that looks at interventions that influence the health of populations. And so that's looking at a much broader level, often the sort of thing that the School of Public Health will do, population level outcome studies, so very large studies in populations, and looking at the social determinants of health. So now you've seen the broad range of translational and clinical research that we do. All right, so you do a lot of research. How do you take that and put it into a guideline? Because there are so many studies that are published that the average physician or healthcare provider in practice couldn't possibly keep up with all of that. So we depend on experts to synthesize all that data and put it in guidelines that are easier to digest and understand to make sure that everybody stays up to date. So the national and international professional societies have guideline and clinical document committees. And so examples of such associations in my field of cardiology are the American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, and the Heart Rhythm Society. So we all have guideline and clinical document committees, and what they do is they review existing guidelines to determine whether they need updating based on new research. So if the last time a guideline was developed, we actually just had a new AFib guideline come out at the end of 2023, and the last major revision of that guideline was way back more than 10 years ago, and so much had changed, it was necessary to do a new one. They also look at new topics for guidelines, so new treatments that come up that hadn't been considered before. Once a topic is identified, then you have to appoint the committees, and you get broad representation of key stakeholders, mostly physicians. With these kinds of documents that I've just been talking about, you would have heart failure specialists as well as electrophysiologists. There's usually also some patient representative, sometimes a patient who has the particular problem that you're studying. Sometimes we include industry as well. It depends on the kind of document you're putting together. Conflicts of interest must be considered. You can't, people wouldn't believe in the legitimacy of guidelines if they were written by people who have a personal interest in whether a particular drug or product is used. So we have to be very careful about that. So how do you get appointed in the first place? Well, expertise in the field. Or have you been participating or leading relevant clinical trials? Do you have research publications and reviews? Do you have a track record of professional society service? Have you been a volunteer? Have you done, I put lesser in quotes here because guideline committees are almost they're pretty much the top of the heap in professional societies. So you want to know that people have done well at sort of a lower level job, so that you can appoint them to something, because they're going to have to work and provide value. They have reliable and useful contributions. They're on time. They do everything that they're supposed to do. And so you look for these people. And then now I'm going to work through, you've appointed a committee, you've checked their conflicts, and now you want to go ahead and actually develop the guideline. Well, where do you start? So you've got the topic, you've got who's going to be working together. The European Society of Cardiology usually does their own documents. So there are European guidelines and US-based guidelines that are like the major ones, and sometimes other parts of the world do them too. The chair and the writing committee are identified, and relationships with industry are vetted. Usually the chairs can have no conflicts of interest with anybody. Pretty hard to get with people who are experts, but we do succeed. When you're on the writing committee, it's okay if you have certain relationships with certain companies, as long as everybody knows it, they're vetted, and you may be able to be asked to write parts of the document for which there is no conflict posed by what it is you're writing about. So for example, is an electrocardiogram a good thing to get in a patient with heart disease? Hard to argue with that one. And really nobody would have a conflict unless you actually ran an ECG machine company, and nobody does that I know of in medicine. Once the committee is formed, you then meet to discuss the major clinical issues and writing assignments, and that has to all be outlined from the beginning, and people assign to different topics. And then we go ahead and do what's called an evidence review. And that is a very laborious process. And Diane Schwartz remembers some years back when I asked her to help me with the 2017 ventricular arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death guideline, because I needed a full PubMed review with every relevant article that had ever been published on it. And she was amazing in getting me the information I needed to start working on this. So, and this is how we did that. You have to have keywords. That'll allow you to do a broad and comprehensive search of the medical literature. You want to capture all relevant clinical and translational research pertinent to the topic at hand. You identify the articles to read in detail. So, some of the articles that pop up don't turn out to be relevant, or they're superseded by better clinical trials, and you'll go and spend more time with those. You decide which ones are the most important and relevant, and you err on the side of being inclusive. That's always better than leaving out something. And then we generate evidence tables. And this is sort of a codified way of entering all the data almost into a spreadsheet kind of thing, so that you capture the key information from each of the articles. Because again, a 10 or 12 page article that you read online, how do you synthesize that so people can easily look at what the key findings are? So I'm going to show you an example of that just shortly. But after we get these evidence tables together, then we develop the guideline. And so we draft recommendations. So we come up with them, and then the writing committee has to develop a consensus with them. So some things are obvious and everybody agrees on. Others are more gray areas that there'll be some debate about what to do. But then we finalize the recommendations in the text. Those documents, those draft documents, are sent out for peer review. And that's very extensive too. And it is not uncommon with one of these that up to 1,000 comments can come back. And the co-chairs usually are the ones tasked with working through all of these and either saying, yep, you're right, we'll make that change. No, we don't agree with you because, or we can't change it because, but just really resolve the issues there. Then you have a final document. The writing committee votes on it. And then that document goes to the society leadership. So, as I said, the American College of Cardiology, the Heart Rhythm Society, for their approval and endorsement. And once that happens, the document's published and you can access it online. So as one example of that, I just mentioned this guideline. So I was on this writing committee. And so you can see it had the 3 major U.S. organizations involved in arrhythmia care. And this was the management of patients with ventricular arrhythmias and the prevention of sudden cardiac death. We also worked in collaboration with the Heart Failure Society of America, and they endorsed this document. This is a list of the writing committee. So we had a chair and a vice chair who did a remarkable job with this. And then you can see a number of representatives here. I was on as an ACC representative, so there was a broad range of people involved in this. Now, it's a little bit harder to see here, but this is one of the most important pages I can show you from a document committee that tells you what the rest of what you're going to see means. And so when we make recommendations, it's showing you what the recommendation is, then the level of evidence that goes along with it. So guideline recommendations are divided into class 1, class 2, and class 3. Class 1 recommendations are those that everybody would agree on. It's the right thing to do. It's indicated. It is effective to do this. It should be done. I mean, those are the kinds of words that you'll see. And everything that follows, in anything in green, is a class 1. Class 2 recommendations are split into class 2A and 2B. And the class 2A recommendations are usually those that we think we have good evidence that it works, but it is not so strong that you could thoroughly criticize the physician for not doing it, because she might have other reasons why to do something different. We know that the intervention is reasonable, it can be useful, it's effective, etc. Class 2B recommendations are weaker ones. And there you'll see language like might be reasonable, might be considered. It's uncertain. And I would say with a 2B recommendation, it's weak, and you really could not, it would be very, very difficult to criticize a physician for not doing whatever this is, what you're talking about. And certainly from the standpoint of, say, medical malpractice, that sort of thing, I hate to bring that up, but it's a reality. No one would be able to look at a class 2B and then criticize a physician for not doing it, because the evidence really isn't that strong for it. And then finally, class 3 are things you should not do, period. And you should not do them either because there's no benefit. It's been tried and it just doesn't work, so why do it? Or it actually causes harm. And certainly that's our primary mandate in medicine, is do no harm. So you do not want to do, we should not be doing anything that's labeled class 3. Now on the right-hand side, in the varying shades of blue, there's a second qualifier that comes in these guidelines that's also worth knowing about. So a level of evidence A means that multiple clinical trials have demonstrated the value of the therapy. So a lot of times class 1 recommendations have level A evidence, because that's the strongest we have. Level B R means that you've got moderate quality randomized clinical trials, meta-analyses. Maybe there's just one study that's been done, and we always hesitate to make something a class 1 recommendation if only one trial has been done. But R stands for randomized. The next one, B, NR, means non-randomized. And so that even gets a little bit less strong. But we will look at those and see if they give us any information that's helpful. Then you get down to level C. And level C, LD, means limited data. And so we just really have very little data to go on. And then the next one, level C, EO, means expert opinion. I'll give you one example, though. I mentioned ECGs before. Anybody who has cardiac disease would normally come to a cardiologist's office and get an ECG, right? I haven't looked again at the guideline, but there's no randomized clinical trial that tells us that's the right thing to do. It's expert opinion. So sometimes that's okay. But anyway, those are the levels there. So if you ever have to, you come back and refer to this when you look at the guideline recommendations to remind yourself of what they mean. Now, here's an example of an evidence table. I mentioned that previously. And this was part of what I was asked to do and it had to do with the medical management of cardiac arrest. And so on the left-hand side there, you see study acronym, author, year published. And this was a study that looked at amiodarone versus lidocaine versus placebo in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. That's what OHCA stands for. And what they did, so now the aim of the study in the second column, compare these different interventions when patients have ventricular fibrillation or VT, either of which is going to be fatal if you can't correct it. Can you get better outcomes compared to placebo? Randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, gold standard of a clinical trial, over 3,000 patients. Next column, patient population. Who was it? Basically, patients with cardiac arrest who had IV access and then had one of these arrhythmias. There were exclusion criteria. You can see if they already got the intervention. Study intervention, the next column, what was done, IV amiodarone or lidocaine or placebo. Endpoint results, and in this case, the endpoint was difference in survival to hospital discharge. And you can see amiodarone 24.4% survived, lidocaine 23.7%, placebo 21.0%. So really not very promising, right? And so there was a borderline, if you look at the bottom paragraph there, maybe a borderline result for amiodarone, but certainly not a resounding endorsement of using either one of those two drugs in these settings. Realistically, when you have somebody who's had a cardiac arrest and you can't get them back, their rhythm back, we do use amiodarone because if you're looking at a patient who would otherwise die, I'd rather take a 1 or 2% chance that something's going to work rather than not give it to them. So that was an example of an evidence trial. And now here we get into the levels of evidence. So this is here what it says, and I don't know how much you can see really the top there well, but if you have ventricular arrhythmias with hemodynamic instability, you should have a cardioversion done. That's a class 1 recommendation. You must do it. There's no exception to that. And that's based on at least one clinical trial that was non-randomized, because you cannot take patients and randomize them to getting shocked or not, because the ones who don't get shocked will die. So that's why sometimes that's adequate evidence just because of the nature of what it is you're talking about. Then we have with these things we call sound bites or word, basically the wording there explains why we have that recommendation, and it gives you the references at the end of that. You can see 1 and 5. Those are references you'd look to if you wanted more information. And then the next recommendation has multiple randomized clinical trials because it's an A. It's also a 1, and then it shows what else you can do. So these are the recommendations as they would pop up. And then again, I took these right from the guidelines so that you can see how they wind up presenting. So class of recommendation 1, these are all class 1s, all things you should do. And here, level of evidence A, multiple strong trials telling you do advanced cardiac life support. You might look at that and say, well, everybody knows that, but we do put it in the guidelines. And so those are strong recommendations. Now, I mentioned expert opinion at the bottom. You can take a look at that and you can see this is a truism in cardiology that, again, doesn't have a randomized trial to go with it. But if somebody has a wide, what we call a wide QRS tachycardia, that comes from the electrocardiogram. But what it means is that it's not a normal looking complex. The rule of thumb is treat it like a life-threatening arrhythmia if you're not sure, because you're really unlikely to hurt the patient if it's a more benign arrhythmia, and you certainly don't want to miss treating an important one. And so, I don't want to go through all of these, but again, I'm just showing you that there are examples here where you will have 2A recommendations, and then there's a 2B recommendation here it's using epinephrine during a cardiac arrest. And so 2A, again, weight of evidence is in favor of giving the therapy. 2B is against it. And then we go all the way down to class 3s. So the first one that says no benefit, we know that giving patients high dose epinephrine, very large boluses, compared to standard boluses doesn't work. So that was a randomized trial that did that. So we learned that doesn't help. Down at the bottom there, we show harm that if you give patients who have a heart attack, a myocardial infarction, we don't routinely give them lidocaine or amiodarone anymore to prevent VT because number one, it doesn't work, and number two, it harms patients, and that's why that recommendation says what it does. So, and then one more thing about the guidelines, there are a lot of these kinds of decision trees in there, and it starts at the top here with a patient has ventricular tachycardia. Are they stable or unstable? If you're unstable, you shock them right away. If they're stable, you get an ECG. You know, you have a little more time to do something. But then ultimately, you can see that there are green boxes there that really are all saying cardioversion or catheter ablation. The sort of light orange boxes are 2A recommendations, and the 2B is a darker orange. And so these are all found in the guidelines as well. All right. Now, in terms of these guidelines, there's a guideline app. You can find any of these online. When I need information from a clinical practice guideline, I go to ACC, the American College of Cardiology, acc.org, and they have a guideline hub. And what it shows you, just dry through, the PDF of the guideline, there's a hub. You can download the slides that go along with it. Usually if I just had to give a lecture on the new AFib guidelines, I went directly to that website, downloaded their 117 slides or whatever it was, and then used them to create a presentation. So they're hugely helpful if you want to know more about it or get that information. PDFs and PowerPoints are all available there. So, and this is an example of what the hub itself would look like. And so you can see, go to the JACC article or download the PDF. Then sometimes these guidelines are so huge that having an executive summary is very helpful. There's also key points to remember. I like those as well. As I mentioned, you get a slide set, news stories, guideline education, and even patient resources. This is true for every guideline we have. And so it's a great way of getting more information. Now, I brought this up just to show that once we publish these guidelines, then medical education companies get in on this too. So it'll be shown at the major cardiology meetings or whatever field it is. Medscape does a lot of this kind of education, and they did an update from the new guidelines, and they've published all of this. And so you'll get emails and reminders about this kind of stuff. Or if you go on Medscape, you can find any of this kind of things very easily, and they're good resources as well. So, all right, we've got guidelines, and we have published them, and there's been a Medscape article, and you went to the national meeting, and there it all was. Now, though, if we don't implement them, they're really not very helpful, are they? And so there's also something called implementation science. And so here we wanted to look at implementation strategies. So looking at systematic reviews of ways of encouraging healthcare providers to actually implement the guideline recommendations. And so in this study, they looked at 4 intervention strategies. So one was reminders, could be email, could be an electronic health record. Educational outreach visits, so people come and give grand rounds at your institution kind of thing. Audit and feedback, so that would be the sort of thing where, I mentioned defibrillators work in patients with bad heart function and heart failure. The electronic health record can be programmed with a pop-up that says, your patient fits the indications for an ICD. Do you think you ought to consider it? And so, and then do you follow through on that? And then various provider incentives were looked at. So what they found was that what is generally effective in improving process of care and clinical outcomes is audit and feedback, as well as educational outreach. Physicians don't want to know that they're practicing out-of-date care, and they truly do want to do the right thing by their patients. So when they learn that they do try to implement it. Provider incentives showed mixed effectiveness for improving both the process of care and clinical outcomes, and the reminders showed mixed effectiveness for improving process of care, and they're not effective for clinical outcomes. So this is useful information too, because the next time a guideline comes out, it's good to remember this in terms of planning how you're going to educate people. All right. What kinds of barriers do healthcare providers identify as interfering with adherence to guidelines? Time is always a problem. I don't have enough time. I don't have the staffing. I can't remember. I don't have time to have that discussion with a patient about a defibrillator. I'm not so sure it works anyway. I really don't know the guidelines, and I'll get to them some point, but I can't worry about it now. And the older the clinician, the more likely they are not to adapt with new guidelines. So what helps? Well, formats, resources, and end user involvement in the guidelines. So stakeholder involvement, leadership support, the scope of implementation, is organizational culture set up with multidisciplinary teams to make sure that guidelines are adhered to. Frankly, if you have low baseline adherence to start with, it's usually pretty easy to get better than that. And then electronic guideline systems are also helpful. Now, next section here, I just want to talk a little bit about patient resources, because there's a lot of good ones out there. American Heart Association has them, and they are very outwardly focused to the patient, to the public. The American College of Cardiology has patient resources, the Heart Rhythm Society. SCARisk.org is sudden cardiac arrest risk. And so that's a patient oriented website. SADS, sudden adult, it's adult death syndrome, sudden unexpected adult cardiac arrest. This is an example of what you might find. This is the American Heart Association talking about the difference between a cardiac arrest, which is an arrhythmia, it's an electrical problem, and a heart attack is a circulation problem. All of this stuff can be found online. It shows you what to do under different circumstances, and they're meant at an 8th grade level. So it's usually pretty easy for patients to understand this. Here's a fact sheet from another organization. This is the suddencardiacarrest.org. There are genetic conditions that make patients prone to sudden cardiac arrest. And that's one of the reasons why groups like this have come together. A lot of times it's been young adults or children who have had cardiac arrest, and you can imagine that gets a great deal of attention. This is from the Heart Rhythm Society talking about what sudden cardiac death is. And again, it's patient information. So there's a lot of that kind of information available. This is, I just wanted to pull up to make it a little bit easier to see what it is we're telling patients about cardiac arrest. So sudden cardiac arrest happens when the heart suddenly stops beating, and it's a medical emergency, and patients will die if they don't get treatment right away. So you call 911, you start CPR, and then there's other information there about how that gets treated. And then it tells you which patients this applies to and which ones it doesn't apply to. So PVCs, or single extra beats in the heart, are not an uncommon finding. Lots of people have them. And a lot of people are scared that it means they're going to have a sudden cardiac arrest, whereas in most cases, that's not true. They're harmless. And if you get checked out by a physician and they tell you that, you can be reassured. Other kinds of patient education, steps to reduce the risk for patients, keep the key risk factors for heart disease in check. That means, treating high blood pressure, cholesterol, obesity, diabetes, taking prescribed medications. It's interesting to me how often I run into people who just say, I don't want to take medication. I want to do it all on my own. Very, very hard in certain cases. So things like reducing a very elevated cholesterol is not easy to do unless you're very committed to a very strict diet. And that can be done. And some people do that successfully, like a vegan diet. But aside from that, a lot of times patients it's simpler for them and very, very effective to take medications. There are procedures that can be done. Shared decision making is where we sit down with the patient and go through why an intervention may be useful for them and how it could help them. I usually find that is, that's critically important for devices because that's a surgery and it's a, invasion of the body. Medicine's not as much. The medicines where I usually have to do more talking is when we're talking about anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation, in which case there's a risk of bleeding associated with it and patients have to understand it. So in conclusion of what I've been presenting to you so far, the goal of clinical research is to develop new knowledge to improve the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of human disease. Guideline development is a rigorous process to assure that the results of clinical trials are synthesized into the best recommendations for the treatment of patients. And then finally, once guidelines are developed, education of healthcare providers and patients is critical to disseminate the recommendations so the greatest number of patients can benefit. And now we're going to go on to a breakout because I want you to see a little more directly how this works. And so I mentioned previously that there's a brand new guideline for the diagnosis and management of atrial fibrillation, which is the most common sustained arrhythmia we see in the adult population. So, and 9% of the population over the age of 80 has it. So it's very, very common. So we needed a new guideline. It was developed. The guideline itself should be in the chat box, and Catherine can weigh in a minute if she needs to say anything more about that. What I want you to do is to open up the guideline and go to page 135. And I picked this one because it's something that any of us can understand. It's about lifestyle and risk factor modification. And so what we mean by that is what can you do yourself? And this is not drugs and not devices. This is you as a patient who might potentially be at risk of developing atrial fibrillation or who has already had an episode. What can you do to change your lifestyle or manage your risk factors to lessen the chances that you'll have atrial fibrillation or recurrences? So I want you to go to page 135. Pick out one of them. There's alcohol, there's exercise, there's obesity, there's diabetes, a whole bunch of them. Pick out one aspect of lifestyle that you see and look up one or more of the studies referenced in that section. I put here, this is the link to PubMed. When I want to look up documents, I go to PubMed. That's the golden source. When you look at this guideline and you want to pick out what you want to look up, the reference numbers are listed there. You should be able to click on the reference number and it'll take you directly to the reference in the back of the document. If for any reason that doesn't work, the references do start on page 236 and just look for the number reference that you want. So find the reference, then go to PubMed and look it up, and then just look at the sort of the results and conclusions there and see why that conclusion might have led to the recommendation that you see in the guideline. So that's what I want everybody to do. Catherine, any comments to make at this point?
We have a small enough group that I don't know if we need to do a breakout group.
Okay.
But I think what we can do is we can show them. I'm actually going to see if you can stop sharing.
Yep.
And I'm going to open the guidelines.
Okay.
And then I'm going to share. Okay, so if you see here, I've opened the guidelines and we're going to go to page 135 where all of the choices actually begin. So here's the first one. So let me see. So this is the recommendations for primary prevention. And if we look at our first one here.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily do that yet. Because this way we could show them. So if they go to Yeah, you don't want to move from
And
there.
you can pick out any of them. So
Yeah.
let's say I am more interested in physical fitness.
Right.
I scroll down to the recommendations for physical fitness right here.
Is if you look in that next where you see the green box with a 1 in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but for everybody who's on this, if you go to page 135, if you open the PDF itself, you can see that, all right, it says it says recommendation specific supportive text on there. You can see aerobic exercise training may contribute to a reduction in AFib burden and improve maintenance of sinus rhythm. And then it has 2-5 there. If you click on that, if you click on that, it will take you to references 2, 3, 4, and 5. See, right like this. And then you could look at 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then go pick out one of those and look it up on PubMed so that you can see what the article was and why they referenced it when they said exercise helps prevent AFib. That's what I was looking for us to do.
Okay, so everybody go to what I put in the chat and go to page 135, please. And what I want you to do is just pick something that's of interest to you. And all you're going to do is look at 2 articles. Is that correct? Is that good?
Right, that's good enough. Yeah.
Everybody's going to look at 2 articles, and then you're going to read the abstracts primarily.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah, because there's not enough time to do more than that.
Yes, and if you could put your slide back up for what you want them to do, they can come back and reference that slide. So if everyone could take, let's start with 10 to 15 minutes. If we need more, we'll take it. And what I'd like you to do is, again, go to page 135 within the document that I put into the chat and start looking through that and finding what interests you. I went to, for example, fitness. If you were to look at and read a small portion of that section, you're going to see some numbers after specific references. Click on those. It will take you to page 236. And then if, for instance, I wanted to look at articles 2 through 5, I'm going to pick maybe articles 2 and 3. Take a look at their abstracts, and you're going to basically just explain how the 2 studies you looked at by just reading the abstracts support the recommendations in the guideline. So let's start by taking about 15 minutes to do this. And then we're going to come back together as a group. And if I look at our time, we're going to come back together as a group. So how about we come back at 5:10? Okay, let's see. Does anybody want to share? Who would like to share with the group? I can share first if you want me to.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Do the icebreaker.
I did look at the physical activity, and I looked at a couple of things. And the first thing I looked at was the fact that exercise training should target 210 minutes per week and should be prescribed to reduce the frequency and duration of atrial fibrillation episodes while improving cardiorespiratory fitness and symptom severity. So I took a look at the article that was connected to that, and it did say that when it looked at a control group versus a group that did pretty much moderate aerobic exercise type of exercises, both at home and also in a setting where it was supervised, that after 6 months it decreased about 40% in the exercise group versus 20% in the control group, which is pretty significant. So obviously exercise does help with atrial fibrillation. And then I went on, and the guidelines also talk about how it looked at low intensity aerobic exercise versus moderate exercise. And by all means, you can do high vigorous exercise, but that is what's stopping, I believe, a lot of people from doing it because it's hard. And it looked at that study, and it said basically there wasn't a huge difference between people who did high intensity and those that did moderate intensity. And so I would think a good recommendation was, well, do moderate intensity because of the fact that it's still going to have a benefit for you, and it's going to be less taxing on you, and it's something you're probably going to continue with versus that high intensity. So because of the fact that they want you to do exercise, and that's a great way in order to combat these problems. You might as well do it and do moderate levels because of the fact that it's something you're probably going to continue and just feel better at all around. That's what I read anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a great, yeah. And and you can look at the cardiovascular benefits of exercise in all different kinds of ways. And in some cases, I mean, firstly, just fitness itself. But it does reduce, I mean, exercising well, prevents dementia, there's a lot of different things that it goes with. So it is very important for us to do. But I like your observation about the moderate intensity because you're right. You have to be able to stick with it. And, there's a reason why most New Year's resolutions fail. They're too hard for people to do and they don't stick with it. And so that, and for my own patients, when they are sedentary, I always encourage them to at least start walking.
Exactly.
People can do that. And if you find a routine, a buddy, something like that, that's good. Now, I have to say, it wouldn't be so intuitively obvious that exercising would reduce the risk of atrial fibrillation because it's related to a lot of other things like high blood pressure and other problems that are unique to the heart. So it's not going to help everybody. If people have bad valvular heart disease, either valves that are stenotic or leaky, then maybe that's going to predominate over the exercise. But we have an awful lot of patients that we see who have little to no identifiable cardiovascular disease, and then they develop this atrial fibrillation. Those are the ones I think are particularly well suited to this kind of lifestyle modification. The other thing we know from all of this lifestyle modification is that people who do it and then have an ablation done are less likely to have recurrences. So that's another big thing. If you're going to go through a procedure, you want to maximize your chances that's not going to come back. And last thing I'll say before we ask for other input, there are a lot of I think good comprehensive care of atrial fibrillation tells us that if a patient's about to go through sleep apnea, for example, is very much related to risk of atrial fibrillation. Well, if patients have, obesity and sleep apnea and all these other things, and then they want to have an ablation, they're going to have a recurrence rate that's much higher than other patients. And so encouraging, if you say you're going to help yourself have less of a chance of recurrence if you do these things in advance, I think those are important lessons for patients, and none of them involve taking a drug. So that's a good thing.
Right. And yeah, I thought it was really interesting. These guidelines are very easy actually to read, and especially if you're reading the abstract and get some pretty important information from it. So I would think if you're a doctor, even better, because then you can refer to them whenever possible. Sure. And I'm not. So it was still pretty easy to read.
That was my point of trying to pick these kinds of things. Anybody else here willing to share anything they looked up? Anybody look up alcohol? That's one we almost hate to see that there's a connection there.
I'm going to go to Cedric. Did you look up anything?
I did. I did hypertension.
Do you mind sharing a little bit?
Sure.
Thanks.
So the first, obviously, hypertension is the highest attributable risk for the fibrillation in observational data. So I went with that one. The first article I read was titled Hypertension and Vascular Disease by A.E. Doyle. Essentially, the article went into researching over time how utilizing antihypertensive drug treatments altered the major grade of the coronary events away from things like heart failure and hemorrhaging, and it prolonged life further towards things like myocardial infarction and stroke. So it said it was helpful, but not in the long run, because you're still going to have those cardiac events, while they are less severe and life-threatening. So that is mildly helpful, I would say. So it sounds like rather than treatment, it is preventative measures that need to be taken for.
Okay. Did the articles that you read say anything about atrial fibrillation?
Let's see. I believe the second one did, yes.
Okay, and what did it say about that?
So the second one was mostly about incapacitating events, including atrial fibrillation, over a defined period. And that one was very well written and had really cool stratified data. It is by N. Poulter and M.G. Marmot. And so they also separated their data into communities like the Black population, who have a much higher rate of coronary events, as well as men versus women, and further. So they went into the risk factors, including alcohol consumption and others, noting that those major issues are clustered along with hypertensive individuals. So people that are hypertensive typically have higher use of alcohol or lower physical activity. And essentially what they came up with was the hypertensive medications affected metabolism in a way that was not super positive for the long run of individuals. And so again, it was more the other factors that needed to be changed rather than lowering the blood pressure via medication, because medications don't do the same lowering blood pressure to prevent atrial fibrillations that physical activity would, because of the effects of drugs on the metabolomics.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why we think that hypertension, treatment of hypertension helps is simply by lowering the blood pressure, you lower the strain on the heart, right? And one of the thoughts that we have about atrial fibrillation, how it develops and how it persists over time, we see the term atrial myopathy. And so over time, the atria put under load conditions like valvular heart disease or hypertension. That load then tends to cause stretch of the atrium and fibrosis. And those kinds of problems then disorganize the electrical activity of the atria, which promotes atrial fibrillation. So that's one way that getting the high blood pressure to treat that better, you'd have a lower risk of having atrial fibrillation occur and recur. So yeah, so it was good to pick atrial high blood pressure, because that hypertension treatment is a real cornerstone of what we need to do for patients.
And Sandra, thank you for sharing. That was really wonderful.
Yes.
Liz, did you look up anything?
Yeah, I can share something.
Oh, thanks.
Great.
What did you look up?
I actually went to the caffeine consumption recommendation.
Oh,
Okay, that's a good one.
And it is a no benefit recommendation. And it is, so the recommendation was for patients with AFib, recommending caffeine abstention to prevent AFib episodes is of no benefit, although it may reduce symptoms in patients who report caffeine triggers or worsens AFib symptoms. So in the first article that I read, they had surveyed about 33,000 healthy women and who are 45 years of age and free of cardiovascular disease and AFib. All of the women provided information on their caffeine intake via food frequency questionnaires.
Uh-huh.
And they had found in the end that in the healthy women, elevated caffeine consumption was not associated with an increased risk of incident AFib. So again, no benefit like the recommendation states. And therefore their data suggests that elevated caffeine consumption does not contribute to the increasing burden of AFib in the population. In the other article that I had went through, they had taken a different approach. They had 2 reviewers who independently searched for studies via online databases and had found similar things in 7 observational studies that had evaluated about 116,000 people. Again, found that caffeine exposure was not associated with an increased risk of AFib.
No, that's a great one. I'm glad you looked that one up because it's such an obvious thing that people think. And in years past, not just atrial fibrillation, but for any other kinds of supraventricular arrhythmias, I've known physicians to tell patients not to drink caffeine. And, and for some patients, that's a real, I mean, they, love their coffee and, they're being told they can't have it. And yet for us to do that without proving that it has any benefit, it's unfortunate, but it's great when we can prove these things and then change the paradigm or change what patients are told. And so, I think that was an important one for us to understand. So a lot of these things do make a difference, but whether or not patients are drinking caffeine doesn't. And so, we leave them alone. There could be the rare exceptions to that. If somebody is just chugging Red Bulls all day long, if you go to a real extreme, you can get yourself in trouble. I think a lot of times the reasons why patients are reporting palpitations is simply that they get a mild sinus tachycardia from the caffeine. So it can elevate your heart rate a little bit, but it's a normal rhythm and it'll go away just as the caffeine wears off. So that's a good observation. So thank you for sharing that.
Great. Would anybody else like to share, or does anybody else have any questions? Because we are nearing our end time. And I think one of the good things that we learned is these guidelines are actually pretty easy to read, especially if you're going to be glancing at the articles and looking at the areas that interest you. Obviously, this is more for doctors, but I think at the same time, the caffeine one was amazing because I have heard people that have been told to stop drinking caffeine. And it's not even true for the most. So we know that Red Bulls are terrible for you because the amount of caffeine in them is just
huge,
exorbitant in comparison to a normal cup of coffee.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. Very good.
Now that we're at the end of the meeting, I would just like to take a minute to sincerely thank Dr. Curtis for her participation. She's been a dedicated participant in this program since its inception, and she always does a great job. She takes it very seriously, and there's always something new to contribute. And her continued involvement in things in producing clinical practice guidelines is a strong indicator of her commitment to excellence in information sharing, evidence-based practice, and as an instructor and role model for our students. So thank you, Dr. Curtis.
Well, thank you, Diana. Thank you, Catherine, for all your help in setting this up.